Welcome back to the Naughty Archaeologist podcast. Thanks again for joining us. We're really excited to see you nerds. And today's episode is going to be on the labelle, or the bell, because if we say it the labelle, we're just saying the bell. Found on the seafloor in Matagorda Bay in South Texas in the Gulf. The bell is part of a kit and was, instead of just traveling as a kit, they just put it together and then sailed it. I don't have any other announcements for you nerds, so without further ado, let's get wet.
Avast! It's complicit. The timbers were way too big, but what really tells the story are thousands of pieces. We looked at them all. The treasure was not gold or silver, it was the people.
Welcome back, nerds. We are in it. Today's episode is going to be on the labelle, or just bell. Le belle. French is not my first language, and something to know is there's going to be a lot of French words in this episode, so you are welcome to make fun of me, and in fact, I encourage it. The bell is actually one of the bigger ships in nautical archaeology, and I say that a little tongue-in-cheek because the labelle is actually a very small ship, and she's what's called a barque longue. Don't worry, I'll tell you exactly what it is. A barque longue is just a much smaller ship, and it's defined by the way that it was rigged, just like all of these other ships that we're talking about. Lateen rigged, or a schooner has, the square sail and the topsail, and so the barque longue is very similar to that. The labelle was found in 1995, is when she was confirmed to be in existence. She was discovered and suspected somewhere around 1975, 1978. A lot of people went through a lot of trouble to get their hands on a lot of archival records and a lot of diaries, and there was a lot of historical records requests put in to the Texas Historical Commission. When the French lost labelle, they actually did a really good job of documenting where it was. There are survivor accounts from the wreck because it just was sank in a storm. The biggest problems that archaeologists were running into, as well as historians, is the sediment. And the technology limitations at the time were also plagued by serious funding issues. And we'll actually get into that with Dr. Bruseth. So I just want to kind of open up with a little timeline of events, as well as a couple of vocabulary terms that I want you to remember. You ready? It's called a barque and a ketch. K-E-T-C-H. Now, I know that sounds like a play in a baseball game, a bark and catch, but it's not. A bark and a ketch are mostly very similar, but they differ in how they're rigged. A bark, just like most of the other shipwrecks that we've talked about, is a sailing ship, usually three-masted, with a foremast and a mainmast that are square-rigged, with a mizzenmast that is rigged fore and aft, right? So we've got the front and the back. Now a ketch, it's kind of similar, except it's a sailing ship with two masts that is fore and aft rig, and then with a mizzenmast stepping forward of the rudder and smaller than the foremast. What is the foremast, you ask? Well, it's the mast at the fore of the ship. Essentially the front, near the bow. Now for the timeline. The labelle is what's called a French barque, and she was built in La Rochelle in France. But originally, she was a kit. And just like a kit, she was meant to be assembled somewhere else. This one, in this instance, in the New World. So she was actually numbered almost like a Lego kit. Ultimately, she was going to be just kind of packed into the cargo of Le Jolie, which was another ship that was selected for an individual's expedition to the New World, to claim it for France. So I'm going to do my best, but of course this man has as many R's in his name as possible. Rene-Robert Cavelier Sieur, as I understand the pronunciations. That could be completely off. Please make fun of me. On the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, he has several names, possibly all of them nicknames or titles. I'm not entirely sure, but they call him founder of Lachine, Seigneur of Cataraqui, discoverer of the mouths of the Mississippi. Either way, he was born in Rouen in 1643 and is the son of a haberdasher. Initially, Sieur de la Salle thought he was going to be a Jesuit missionary for his whole life. He studied at the Jesuit college until about 1658, and then he went into the Society of Jesus in Paris. He spent 9 years there. He took his vows in 1660, and then he studied at Le Flèche. Le Flèche? I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure about any of these pronunciations, so I'm just going to stop saying I don't know, and I'm going to wing it. Now, he studied at Le Flèche, and he studied physics and logic. I'm not entirely sure how one studies logic, but that's what he did. As well as mathematics. He really liked that. And then he went on to be a teacher at the secondary school at Alençon, and then again at Tours and Blois from 1664 to 1666. But then, and this is something that really I love, the Canadian biography website that I've been using as a source for Monsieur de la Salle's biography and a little bit of background, says, apparently this young scholastic felt a perpetual need to change his occupation and environment. Inquietus was the word used to describe his lack of steadiness. He would grow bored and lose interest in his work, yet despite everything, he displayed real gifts, particularly in mathematics. On the other hand, his superiors held his judgment in rather low esteem, and had a scarcely higher opinion of his discretion. End quote. Sounds like he had a little bit of ADHD and an ego, which everyone knows is the worst combination. After he was done teaching at La Flèche and Blois, he was very poor. He took vows, and then he got released from those vows because he was restless and a little bit temperamental. And so he decided that he was just going to go be an explorer, because that's really all he had by way of options. His family was relatively wealthy, but because his father died before he was released from his vows, as well as he had taken a vow of poverty, so legally he couldn't really take any of the money even if his father had left him some. So, without any money, he sells Daddy's estate and he moves to Montreal. There, La Salle learned to trade with the First Nations people and was included in councils from the Seneca and the Iroquois, and even the Ottawa. Not councils in leadership positions, mind you. He was not that important. But he did learn native customs and how they trade and the importance of leaning on the Indigenous population as a Frenchman. After this point, there is a little bit of debate as to what La Salle was doing with his time up until about 1670. It's about at this point that he's doing some stuff either in Montreal, or also he could be just kind of putting around Ville-Marie, which was a colony in the area. It is somewhere within these two intervals where he could have possibly made the quote-unquote discovery of the Ohio or the Mississippi rivers. And it's about 10 months or so from the 1670 autumn to around the summer of 1671, and then somewhere in the 16 months separating 1671 to Christmas of 1672. Now, let me get this on the record before anyone comes at me for the discovery quote. I know La Salle did not discover the Ohio or the Mississippi, but that the Iroquois were definitely aware of those rivers' existence. It is not that La Salle discovered them in a broad sense of, did you guys know these were here? He discovered them for quote-unquote France, and for the colonials who had come to colonize the New World. Capiche? Cool. Now, moving on. This is important later, because La Salle is generally, in France's eyes, credited with the quote-unquote discovery of the Great River Ohio, as well as, in some cases, the Mississippi. This is generally up for debate, and it comes from a Father Bernoux, who was kind of the record keeper in La Salle's expedition during this time frame. By 1673, La Salle is back in Montreal. Almost hilariously, La Salle makes a series of political maneuvers to the point where he essentially starts his own colony. And because he was friends with a man named Frontenac, he was able to acquire letters of nobility for himself and his descendants. He named the fort Frontenac. He also knew that if he could just get posted on Lake Ontario, he would have the cushiest post, as well as a ton of money if he could just stay there. But I guess he didn't really want to stick around anywhere, and he, in 1677, returned to the court of France to seek authorization to make 2 establishments, one at the entrance to Lake Erie and another one at the exit of Lake Michigan. Again, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography to the rescue with these quotes. They're killing me. Quote, "Yet Fort Frontenac was not enough for him. In 1677, he returned to the court to seek authorization to construct, at his own expense," internal quote, "2 establishments, one at the entrance to Lake Erie, the other at the exit from the Lac de Illinois, Michigan, to become seigneur of the lands that he might discover and populate, to receive ownership of all the cleared lands that the Indians might abandon of their own accord, as they do sometimes, and the office of governor in the said territories." End internal quote. Despite his detractors, in whose eyes his inordinate ambitions put him on the level of a fool, quote, "fit and ready for the madhouse," end quote, the explorer, thanks to his powers of persuasion and to the good offices of some friends in court, obtained permission from the king, 12 May 1678, to reconnoiter the western part of North America between New France, Florida, and Mexico. End total quote. From 1679 until about 1683, La Salle, with 14 men and 4 canoes, explored the Great Lakes region as well as down the Mississippi and into as much territory as he could get through. He got all the way down into Louisiana, claimed it for France, saw the ocean, and then flipped a U-turn and headed right on back up into the Great Lakes region. While on this journey, La Salle encountered several Native American indigenous tribes, including the Illinois, the Miami, the Ottawas. He had already been trading with the Iroquois, and then he had also come into contact with the much more southern tribes of the Arkansas area, including the Teenses, the Arkansas, as well as the Corowas. I really hope I'm saying all of those correctly. To any indigenous folks, I sincerely apologize if I am not. In addition to trading with the indigenous nations that he found along the way, he also established several forts and claimed all of their land for France. To him, they're not people. They don't have nations. They don't have borders. They have some kind of amorphous boundaries and some floaty, wibbly-wobbly blending of border lines. And some territories do have some hard lines. To La Salle, though, they're just natives. They're not real people. They're not white. And so they don't count. After spending some time at Fort St. Louis, La Salle actually boards the Saint-Honoré, and he goes back to La Rochelle in France just before Christmas in 1683. Here, La Salle really wanted to make the idea of a colony in Louisiana really appealing to the king. He absolutely straight up just lied. According to historical documents, he falsified the geography of the Mississippi and made maps where the River Colbert, which is what he called it, deviated, quote, 250 leagues westward from its real course and emptied into the Gulf in the vicinity of New Mexico, end quote. For our international listeners, New Mexico doesn't have a coastline at all. Additional lies that were told to the court include, quote, "To titillate the minister, the memoirs did not hesitate to say, although the explorer, better than anyone, was familiar with the petrified tree trunks that blocked the Colbert Delta, that The river he has discovered is an excellent port, which large vessels can ascend to a distance of more than 100 leagues inland, and small boats more than 500. They further declared that, to attack the Spaniards, La Salle could easily recruit an army of 15,000 Indians, having already 4,000 at his disposal around Fort San Luis de Illinois. And finally, they pinpointed the spot where the discoverer claimed to be able to found an establishment, the confluence of the Rivière Rouge and the Mississippi, that is to say, in an area covered with marshes. End quote. And what is absolutely bananas is that it worked. Again, quote, Louis XIV also gave him, among other things, 100 soldiers maintained at royal expense and commanded by 8 officers and non-commissioned officers, a warship carrying 36 cannon and a crew of approximately 70, called the Jolie, in addition to the Belle, a bark of 60 tons armed with 4 small cannon. The convoy was to be completed by the Aimable, a flute of 180 tons fitted out by a La Rochelle merchant, and the Saint-François, a small ketch partly equipped by the intendant of Rochefort. End quote. Don't worry too much about the flute. It just means that it's a Dutch-style cargo ship. All right, you with me? Did you catch that? We now have officially seen Belle come into the fray, as well as Aimable and Jolie. These are some ships that we want to remember. And we're back at the beginning. The La Belle is a little kit, just like Legos, that they were going to put together in the New World when they got down to the area where La Salle promised that they were all going to land. And initially, La Salle proposed going through the St. Lawrence River, as he'd been pretty familiar with that area in the first place. That's where Fort Frontenac is. That's where he had it, restored back to him by the king when he was awarded the 100 soldiers and 8 non-commissioned officers. But additionally, he kind of knew the area, he knew the geography. But the king was like, hey, how about instead of doing it that way, what if you went in the way Spain is doing, right? So you go near Spain and they'll see us and they'll think that we're doing more stuff than actually we are. But also, maybe you could raid those silver mines back in New Mexico while you're on the Mississippi that clearly goes into New Mexico, right? And La Salle, kind of caught in this lie, was like, yes, Your Majesty, of course. Absolutely. This journey is doomed from the start. And it never gets better. So I'm warning you now, it's pretty rough from here on out. La Salle and Tanneguy le Gallois de Beaujeu hated each other. De Beaujeu was the captain of the Jolie, and La Salle didn't care. La Salle looked Beaujeu in the eye and said, look at me, I am the captain now. And he bossed everybody around the entire journey. Custom at the time was genuinely offensive. La Salle attempted to take control of every ship and look at me, I'm the captain now, to the captain. Not only did La Salle cosplay as commander, but during preparations for the voyage, he didn't tell Beaujeu where they were going at all. He didn't tell him the route, he didn't tell him anything about it. And so he didn't actually know what kind of pilots to choose, what kind of sailors to seek, what kind of people he needed as a crew, because he didn't know the route. And so the voyage was destined to just suck. Beaujeu said, quote, I'm going into an unknown country to seek something almost as difficult to find as the Philosopher's Stone, late in the season, laden above the waterline, and with an irritable man. End quote. Beaujeu and his crew were 9 days out to sea when he wrote that. Henri Joutel, often described as a bourgeois from Rouen, wrote most of the diaries and the logs for the journey of this expedition. And so most of what we know of La Salle's expedition out to Matagorda Bay and beyond is from the hand of Henri Joutel. Joutel documents a lot of the issues that the sailors had with La Salle and his crew. And often, as La Salle's right-hand man, Joutel was at the mercy of all of the animosity as well. In a specific instance where La Salle and his crew refused to participate in the tradition of ducking when they cross the Tropic of Cancer, Joutel said, quote, The sailors would gladly have killed us all. End quote. So now it's mid-September, 1684, and the crowded conditions on board the Jolie have everybody dehydrated, and there's not enough drinking water to go around. So they decide to make a stop in what is now Haiti, a place called Pédigouave at the time. When they reach Pédigouave, they all get sick, and a violent attack of fever, where most of them are delirious for about a week. The Aimable and the Belle, eventually catching up, were able to make port in Pédigouave. But everyone was a little concerned that they hadn't seen the San Francois in a little while. And by October 20th, it was confirmed that the catch that had been a large portion of their expedition's provisions and supplies had been captured by Spanish privateers. They reprovisioned, resupplied, tried not to let any more people desert, and then by November 25th, they set out again. By about the end of December, they arrive in the Gulf of Mexico, and they start to see some stuff like, quote, a fine grayish and muddy sand, end quote. It's basically characteristics of the Mississippi Delta. They're indicative of where they are, and so they were right where they were aiming to be. Except that La Salle didn't know that. Back in 1682, when he was floating around the Mississippi and the Arkansas, he was 2 degrees off when he took his measurements at the latitude on the mouth of the Mississippi. So when he tried to find it again, his reckonings were a little off. At this point, a series of incidents happen that can be chalked up to both incompetence or overconfidence, but mostly also just pure misfortune. In February 1685, after scaling the coast trying to find what they're looking for because La Salle is confident that he is right, colonists set foot on dry land for the first time in almost 3 months since leaving Pédigouave. There on the coast of Texas, they establish a temporary camp on the shore. Weeks later, around March 7th, 1685, and against Captain Beauchaud's advice, La Salle says, no, I want the Aimable and the Belle to enter Matagorda Bay. Now, they probably had another name for Matagorda Bay, but he just wanted them in the sheltered harbor. But once they're in Matagorda Bay, against Captain Beauchaud's advice, they're attacked by the local Karankawa nation. This attack was not unprovoked. Some of La Salle's men had stolen canoes from the Karankawas, which were a huge economic resource for them. That's how they fished. That's how they lived. And so they were like, hey, don't touch our stuff. But then the white men became obnoxious, and they touched their stuff and stole their stuff. So the local Karankawas meted out justice. At this point, no one is left to direct the Aimable. And when La Salle returns to his ships, the Aimable has been run aground. And La Salle thinks that Beauchaud did it deliberately. Now, there were some supplies that were recovered, but by 1685, Beauchaud was out of there, and he takes the Jolie and he goes back to France. And by March 1685, there's kind of a little colony established on the coast of Texas. They call it Fort San Luis, though it was never really officially named. After about 6 months living in and around this area, La Salle thinks, you know what, we need to expand. So I'm going to take some guys, we're going to explore, and we're going to check out the local area. We have now gotten to October 1685. Now, during this little field trip, La Salle actually loses 2 captains, Camille Marod in a prickly pear incident, and Eli Richand from Karankawa attack. And then, a few months later, January 1686. La Salle and some men take the La Belle and they go exploring. The La Belle is never seen again. So what happened? Well, off the coast of Texas, some men take a a dinghy or a rowboat I'm not entirely sure what it was, but they took one of the spare boats from the Labelle and they rowed ashore and they were doing some exploring on shore. But they didn't come back, and it had been over 2 weeks. And those on board the Labelle were running out of drinking water. The crew, unskilled, had lost their second anchor, and with high winds in a new storm that had just blown in on a cold front, they ran aground about 400 meters from shore, and out of 27 people originally assigned to the ship, only 6 survive. Some cargo is recovered. But the French settlers are officially stranded. None of their ships remain. And with the sinking of the Belle, so sank all of their hopes to be rescued by the French colonies still in the Caribbean. The Belle was their last ship, and without it, they now had no way to ask for help. As for La Salle, he came back around the end of March, and the bark had already sank. He had lost 6 more men to the Karankawas. La Salle thinks, you know what, we can salvage this, we can do this. And so for almost another year, he really attempts to make a home out of that little fort, which had actually mostly been built out of spare parts from the Aimab. However, in 1687, they're starting to realize maybe the writing is on the wall. La Salle gets a hernia, he's ill quite a bit, they are now at war with the Karankawas kind of openly, and out of 180 people who had established the Little Texas fort a couple years earlier, only 25 people were left. 7 of them were women. La Salle had realized, well, we can't stay here, and we can't go to Mexico, they'll kill us there, and we can't go to the Karankawas, they'll kill us, and we can't go into the ocean, we don't have a ship. What are our options here? I know, the best course of action is to walk back to Canada. That's right, folks, put on your shoes. It is time to go to Canada. I also forgot to mention, La Salle's brother is on this expedition, as well as his nephew. By January 14th, 1687, La Salle and the rest of his men and women had passed the Trinity River in Texas. So they haven't really gotten that far. La Salle had I don't know if he's a friend or a servant, but he's a Shawnee hunter named Nika, and together with Pierre Duhot, and a man only described as Pierre Duhot's surgeon, as well as 3 or 4 others, went ahead to dig up some provisions that La Salle had left behind from a previous voyage. So he had left some cachets of provisions that he was going to return to later. Now, Moranger, La Salle's nephew, and a couple of his companions went out to meet them a couple days later in order to bring back the meat and everything that Nika had slaughtered, as well as, at this point, you find out that Nika has smoked the bison as well and set aside a couple of marrow bones for those who had taken out the bison. But Moranger was not having it, and he claimed all of the flesh of the bison for himself and flew into a rage against the other men. Now, this was kind of the last straw for everybody. Quote, Duhot and his surgeon had long harbored a persistent resentment against Moranger, who had previously abandoned the former in the middle of the forest and had requited the second with brutality for the careful attention he had lavished on his wounds at the time when the Indian canoes were stolen. End quote. So there's a lot of stuff that's brewing here that they weren't really able to take care of back at the fort because they're living in quote-unquote civilized society. But now that they're on the road, there is nothing left for them, and everyone's probably gonna die. They don't care. And so in the middle of the night, the surgeon, assisted by 4 accomplices, used an axe to kill Moranger, Nika, and La Salle's servant, who were all sleeping side by side. Why they killed Nika, I don't know. La Salle and another man of the expedition, a Father Douai, raced towards the murder scene. The killers had already laid a trap. And so when La Salle showed up, he confronts one of them, and they insult him to his face. And so when he turns, they shoot him in the head. Quote, They stripped his corpse and left it naked in a thicket to be devoured by wild animals. They then seized La Salle's possessions, including his famous scarlet cloak, which had survived every shipwreck. Sometime later, feeling the threat of impending justice, the conspirators, all but two, finished killing one another off. End quote. As for everyone else, they actually make it to Canada. They reach Montreal on July 13th, 1688. But okay, we're fast-forwarding 300 years into the future. And it's the 1970s, and Kathleen Gilmore from the South Methodist University makes some inquiries, and she does some analysis of historical accounts. And then in 1977, she gets a record request to Paris from the THC. No, not weed. Like, stay with me, guys. We're the Naughty Podcast. Stay with me. The Texas Historical Commission. And she gets detailed maps, and they reveal the resting place of the bell. And like we said earlier, the French actually kept pretty great records. They know exactly where it's at. But then in 1978, Bartow Arnold, a state marine archaeologist for the Texas Antiquities Commission, which was the predecessor of the THC, he initiated a 10-week search. Now, there's a bunch of wrecks that he found, actually, and probably the La Belle, but he didn't have a lot of money, and there's no funding. So what happens now? Well, that's why we brought in Dr. Jim Bruseth to talk about it. So here we go. We're going to jump over to Dr. Bruseth, and he's going to tell us about his discovery of the La Belle and his subsequent excavation via Cofferdam, which is one of the most unique methods to use in a situation like this because, one, it's expensive. Two, it's never been done since or before. So it is a very unique wreckage, a very unique archaeological dig, and it is a really cool story. So let's bring in Dr. Bruseth. Hi, Jim. I'm Lauren. It's nice to meet you.
Good to meet you, Lauren.
Thanks for joining us today. We want to talk about the La Belle with you.
Sounds great.
Perfect. Can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about who you are, what your background is, and your context in the place of La Belle's history?
Yes, I'm Jim Bruseth. I'm retired from the Texas Historical Commission, where I worked for about 24 years, and I'm now a commissioner for the Texas Historical Commission. So I'm back in a different role with that agency, and my background is in archaeology. I've been doing archaeology in Texas for 45 years, or maybe longer than that. And I was the director of the excavation of La Belle, an amazing archaeological project that set me off on a whole different course in my archaeological career, and allowed me to discover some amazing things and learn some amazing things that I never thought I would ever be thinking about.
Thank you. What were some of those changes? How did it change your trajectory?
Well, the La Belle shipwreck, the way it got started is that I was the director of the archaeology division, and the state marine archaeologist, Bartow Arnold was his name. He worked for me, and he and I got together and said, let's make a major shipwreck find off the Texas coast if we can. And that's hard to do, but anyways, we decided, we looked at all the different shipwreck possibilities and decided on La Salle ship La Belle would be the one we should go for. And with luck, we were able to find that in 1995. And then I directed the excavation, and that set my career in a whole different direction, because before that, I was mostly a terrestrial archaeologist, had done very little nautical work. And of course, then all of a sudden I was the principal behind one of what became one of the most complex and largest nautical archaeological projects in the world at that time. And as a result of that and the subsequent work I did to write the books, I've spent a lot of my career now doing nautical archaeology.
I like nautical archaeology myself, but also my background is in terrestrial archaeology, so it's similar trajectory. So I wanted to ask you, So there's a little bit of a timeline with the LaBelle, and so I wanted to start with the timeline, starting from her construction in France and with Honore Mallet. I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
I don't speak French very well, and by very well I mean none. I want to start with the beginning of the construction because, as I understand it, the LaBelle was a bit of a unique build because of the way it was a kit and the way it was. I do want to start with the shipbuilding and the uniqueness of its nascence and start, and then move into the journey and its delivery essentially to the new world. And then why did it sink a year afterwards? So let's start at the beginning. How was the LaBelle initially built?
Well, it's really interesting. As part of the this project, I've been able to do a lot of research into LaSalle and read his letters and documents related to him. And LaSalle, you have to understand his personality. He was very arrogant and very confident in himself. And so he got a commission from King Louis XIV to establish a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River to hold on to the land he had claimed in 1682 when he discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River and claimed all the land that the Mississippi drained for France. And so King Louis XIV gave him a commission to come on back. And at that time, sailors, particularly in Europe, knew, other than Spain, knew very little about the Gulf of Mexico. And LaSalle really had a program where he wanted to come back to the Mississippi River mouth through the way he knew how to do it, the way he had done it when he discovered the Mississippi River and traveled back, and that's through the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and then find the Mississippi and come on down. And so he wanted to ship in pieces. And so LaBelle was built as a ship kit. And the idea was that he would bring it and he would then he would assemble the ship at the very beginning, the upper reaches of the Mississippi River, and bring it on down to establish his colony at the Mississippi. So as a result, our ship has numbers all over it that allow us to learn how they perceive the ship would be assembled. But over in France in 1684, getting ready for the expedition, LaSalle wanted the pieces of the ship put on the Jolie, a big warship that the king was giving him to use. And the captain, Beaujeu, of that ship complained that there was no room, that LaSalle was bringing so much stuff with him. And so that resulted in LaBelle being assembled in France and sailed over as a ship, a complete ship. And so that allowed then LaBelle to be one of 3 other ships that made the expedition to the New World.
What was the third ship?
Well, the other 3 ships, the Jolie, the big warship, there was a small ketch, Saint Francois, and then there was the Le Mab, a big supply ship. That LaSalle ad hoc, just before they're getting ready to sail, had to lease because he had so much cargo he was bringing with him to the New World. He needed a big supply ship to come over. So those are the 4 ships that set sail in the summer of 1684 with 300 colonists and 100 sailors. And they then made their way across the Atlantic Ocean. And it's interesting. The documents show that LaSalle was not in charge of the expedition while at sea. Captain Beaujeu was in charge of that. And so as a result, LaSalle had arranged through the king that he would meet the governor of the French colony, which is today Haiti, would be there to formally recognize him and to welcome him. But the sailors, they didn't want to go there. They wanted to go to a place called Petit Goave, and they ignored LaSalle's request and ended up in Petit Goave. And we have a wonderful diary of the whole expedition by a man that came over with LaSalle and eventually made it back to France and published his diary. And he talked about Petit Goave as a place where the air was bad, the fruit was the same, and there are a great many women worse than the air or the fruit.
That is rough.
So a little rough there. But anyway, so the sailors ended up in Petit Goave for a period of time. They got some supplies, and then they continued on the journey to the to LaSalle's destination, the Mississippi River, and he missed it by 700 miles. And people have asked me, well, how did that happen? And lots of historians have offered different ideas on what took place there, but I've really been able to dive into it. And I found a map that LaSalle's map maker made of the Gulf of Mexico based upon LaSalle's 1682 discovery of the mouth of the Mississippi River. And you can see exactly what happened is that LaSalle had decided that the Mississippi River that was found by the DeSoto expedition was a different river than his Mississippi River. There were two rivers flowing north-south through the North American continent. And LaSalle put his river way over by almost where the Rio Grande flows today. And so that's why he went way far to the west and then ended up in Matagorda Bay, which his latitude matched what he had calculated when he was at the Mississippi River. And so that's when he thought he was at the Mississippi River. Matagorda Bay, he actually said, this is it. This is the branch of the Mississippi. And he never gave up on realizing that he was terribly lost.
No, everyone, don't worry. I know where I'm at.
Yes, and he argued back and forth, and his engineer Manet would argue with him that they missed the Mississippi River, and it was much further to the east, and LaSalle just wouldn't let it go. In fact, we even have 2 or 3 different letters that LaSalle wrote when he was at Matagorda Bay, and he would sign each one of them at a branch of the Mississippi River.
Oh no. Didn't Murad that's his pilot, his navigator?
Yes.
He died from eating prickly pear, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in fact, several of the people had problems with the prickly pear. They didn't know to burn off the little stickers on them, and so they would get stuck in their throat and they would suffocate.
Oh,
and they thought it was the fruit was poisonous. What they thought.
that's such a painful way to go.
Painful way to go. And you can see these people were desperate for something sweet. And I don't know if you've ever had the prickly pear.
Love prickly pear.
Yeah, it's very sweet. And if you do it right, it's a wonderful can be a wonderful dessert or a wonderful food. But they didn't know how to do that. So his people died of a lot of just amazingly
miserable,
unfortunate circumstances, and part of it was the fact that over in France, when the ships were being readied to come over, they were military men. They were given were going around hiring people to come on board the ship to be part of the expedition, and they were paid by the people they got, how many people they got, and they ended up getting people with no qualifications, some of them being tricked to be part of the expedition. So when LaSalle got to the New World, he found he had a lot of people that didn't know how to do very much. And in fact, the diarist, Henri Joutel, he said that these people don't know how to do very much, but they know how to eat. And they were having trouble feeding everybody.
What I understand is that's a pretty frequent problem, and you'd think that they would pack more food. Or at least like the methods
yes,
for
well,
agriculture.
and they thought they would trade with the Indians and be able to get food that way. But shortly after making landfall in Texas in 1685, some of LaSalle's men had a altercation with the Karankawa Indians and stole some of their canoes. And for the Karankawa, the canoes were their lifeline. That's how they would travel around to get food, to move around, to hunt and stuff like that. And that started a warfare situation with the Karankawa that lasted the entire duration of the expedition stay in Texas. And so they didn't have the Karankawa or other Native Americans that they could trade to get food to help them. And then on top of that, they were a bunch of bison around the area, but they didn't know how to kill a bison. It took them, several months to figure out where you have to shoot a bison that you can get through the hide and actually kill the animal. So
bison are so enormous. You see pictures of them in Yellowstone, and you don't realize how huge they are until you can come face to face with one. We were doing some private property phase 1 work in Oklahoma, and they had a bison in like a weird truck stop on the side of the road. And we stood there by the fence, and those things are huge.
They're huge and they have a very tough hide. And so the French were having trouble penetrating that hide until they learned that there was a good spot where they could get through to the heart and kill the animal. So people ill prepared, and as a result, they had lots and lots of difficulty, and things didn't go very well for LaSalle and his men.
Their expedition lasted about a year. Is that correct?
Well, they made landfall in 1685, and the ships, well, the one Le Saint Francois was lost coming to Haiti by pirates. So they had three ships that made their way to the Gulf Coast into our Texas, and the one the big the Jolly, the big warship, it had instructions to offload cargo, offload expedition colonists, and sail back to France, and it did that. And then Le Mob, the big supply ship, they tried to bring it into Pass Cavallo, into the pass into Matagorda Bay, which is very shallow, and they lost that ship and all the cargo on board. So they were down to a single ship, La Belle, and then they ended up losing La Belle the next year in a storm in Matagorda Bay. And so at that point, in 1687, LaSalle decided that his colony was on the verge of complete failure, had to do something dramatic, couldn't go down into Mexico because that was they were enemies, the Spanish at that time. And so his only hope was to walk to Canada to get help. So in 1687, in the early spring, he and 26 other men started the journey to walk to Canada to get help. And as you probably know, he was shot by his men in eastern Texas. An argument broke out about who was getting the proper rations of food. Some of the men didn't feel like they're getting enough food, and they were tired of LaSalle and his arrogance and his everything failing. And so they shot him in the head, threw his body in the weeds, and eventually 6 men out of that the total 26 plus LaSalle made their way back to Canada, to Quebec, including the diarist, Henri Joutel, and they sailed back to France.
They made it?
And they walked all the way back. They got on ship, sailed back to France, and the diarist, Henri Joutel, he published his diary. And that gives us the wonderful details of everything that was taking place on the expedition. So the expedition went from 1685 to 1687, so a little over 2 years.
Gotcha. So the La Belle is the only one that lasted only a year. The expedition was about 2. Got it. So I
Yeah.
think that's where I was conflating the two. With the La Belle, it sank in a storm. What was it? Do we know what kind of storm? Because it is right there in the Gulf Coast, and it has a reputation for producing some pretty intense storms right there.
Yeah, we have from that journal, the diary, we have a great detail about what took place. And LaSalle, when he landed in Matagorda Bay, he spent time going looking around for the Mississippi River, feeling that it had to be somewhere nearby. And so he traveled here and there in whichever way you could imagine. And at one point he said, okay, well, the Mississippi River is a little further to the east. I'm going to load everything I have left for my final colony at the Mississippi River onto La Belle, sail it as far as I can to the east in Matagorda Bay, and then I'm going to go overland and find the river, come back, get La Belle, and sail it around to the Mississippi. And he told the men on board La Belle, the 16 or so people on board La Belle, that stay here. I'll be gone 2 weeks. I'll come back and get you. And the men on board La Belle, they're there waiting, and the 2 weeks comes and goes, and there's no LaSalle. They decide that they have to go ashore and get some water. They have a single longboat, so they send their best sailors ashore in that longboat, and that boat never comes back. The Karankawa Indians probably attacked and killed those people. So the diary tells us that the people on board La Belle, there were 22 people on board La Belle. The people on board La Belle, they ran out of water, and some people died of thirst on the ship, which is unbelievable when you're in the middle of water. you think somebody would jump in the water and swim ashore, but back then people didn't know how to swim, and thought things get as people started to die. The captain of the ship decides that well, first of all, he was in charge of everything, so he took control of the brandy and the wine. And the journal tells us there wasn't a day that went by that he wasn't drunk. And finally, when things are so bad and people are dying, beginning to die of thirst, he decides he's going to pull up anchor. He's going to sail around to the other end of Matagorda Bay, where LaSalle had established a temporary colony called what we call Fort St. Louis. And as they pull up anchor, a cold front comes through, a very strong cold front, and that causes a tremendous storm. And they only have one anchor that's not enough to stop the ship, and they lose control of LaBelle. And the one anchor they're pulling that anchor, and as a result, the ship is sailing backwards, and it runs ashore in the southern part of Matagorda Bay. And of the people, 22 people that were on board the ship, 6 people eventually make it off the ship onto Matagorda Peninsula, bottom part of Matagorda Bay, and they stayed there for a couple months until miraculously an Indian canoe washes up. They get in it and they sail back over to the Fort St. Louis colony to tell about the loss of the ship. So it just the incompetence and unbelievable problems just multiplied and multiplied throughout the whole expedition.
I remember reading the story and just being like, more? There is more?
Yeah, it's incredible.
There's like snake bites. They kill their own guy with LaSalle. They just walk to Canada.
Walk the kid.
So the LaBelle sits in Matagorda Bay for the rest of its life, essentially, with the Aimable. So where did the Aimable go down?
It went down in the Gulf, just outside of Matagorda Bay. So it's in deeper water.
Were you guys able to excavate the Aimable?
Well, we look for it. We look for it. Lamab. We look for it. The problem is it's in the Gulf of Mexico. It's more difficult, and we did find. Well, we found a number of anomalies, targets for shipwrecks, and we eliminated all of them but one. And the one that we think is probably it. When we went out there, it's about a mile into the Gulf from the shore. And when we probed on down, the probe went down 28 feet and still did not hit it. So it's buried deeply out there, and it's a big ship, but it broke apart, so we don't know what condition it's going to be in. And we did look at maybe excavating it like we did LaBelle by building a cofferdam, but the complexities of that would make it like 50 times more expensive than LaBelle. So we gave up on that and said we'll deal with LaBelle. It's smaller, it's a 54-foot ship in length, and it was a much easier ship to deal with.
So when you and Mr. Bartow Arnold were like, let's go find a shipwreck, how did you guys start that out?
Well, we went through, and Bartow really did a lot of this. He looked at what are all the shipwrecks out there that we know about from historical documents. And then we had a list of, probably the top 10, top 15, and we went through that and said, of all those, the one that really is the most interesting to us, and I think would be a great ship to find, is LaBelle. And so that's how we kind of went through that list. And, and I should say that, when you go out and you look for a shipwreck, 99% of the time, you never find it because it's very, very difficult. And finding a shipwreck in Matagorda Bay, where there's zero visibility, and we have lots of more recent and modern shipwrecks that are down there. Trying to sort through all that can be a big challenge. But for some reason, luck was with us. And I remember after we'd finished surveying with a magnetometer the different targets, and then we looked at them all and we prioritized the targets, and Bartow again gets the credit for this and making the discovery. And we sent divers on down on the first target, the first day, looking for what was down there. And the first target we went down, the divers could feel the lifting handles for a cannon, which meant we had an old shipwreck. And sometime later, we were able to free the cannon up and bring it up, and we saw that it had the insignia of Le Comte de Vermandois, and we found out that he was Admiral of the Navy, and he was made that in 1682 and 1683, and would have been right at the time when the cannon was made, and the perfect time for this cannon then to be incorporated into La Belle. So that's what really sealed the deal, that we found La Belle. And then we also did more research on the Comte de Vermandois and found out that he was made the Admiral of the Navy when he was 2 years old. And that's because his mother was a mistress of King Louis XIV, and this is a way of legitimizing, I guess, the young the Comte de Vermandois.
Admiral.
Yes.
That's royals.
So, I mean, that's a good example of the kinds of twists and turns and unique things we learned from the shipwreck. Just many, many different things that we learned about that we had no idea we would ever unravel, and how confusing and complex they make the overall story.
When you were able to pull the cannon out, and you guys have funding, you guys have a research vessel and the cofferdam, how did the cofferdam get proposed?
Well, that was, Bartow really suggested we do that. And when he said that, I completely agreed with him, because when we found La Belle, we didn't know exactly how much was down there. We brought up a number of artifacts, enough to identify that it's French. It's clearly La Belle. And we were concerned that trying to do a traditional underwater archaeological excavation in zero visibility can be challenging at best. And if you have delicate artifacts, it's difficult to deal with those things. And so the cofferdam seemed to be a great idea. The only problem is that it had never been done in our hemisphere of the world. It had been done in Europe on a different scale on a few projects, but nothing of the magnitude that we were planning to do. And we got the funding and built the cofferdam. And I remember when we were building it, the engineers told us that it's going to leak. You can't make it watertight. And he said, but we think we can put some sump pumps down there and pump the water out and make it a dry environment down there and keep up with the leakage. And so it was kind of a big gamble, because we were spending, a couple $1 million on all this, and at that time, and it might not work. But it did work. And it worked great, but the only problem is we had to keep diesel generators going 24/7 to keep the sump pumps pumping up the water that was leaking through the walls of the cofferdam. And we did have, during a couple fierce storms, we lost power, and we did get water coming up into the cofferdam. But the next day, we're able, in both cases, to get the generators restarted and pump the water back down. So it worked out great. So we found La Belle in 1995. We excavated her from September of 1996 to April of 1997.
What is the significance? Because the cofferdam is an expensive thing to do, but it's also, like you were saying, it's only really been done a couple of times at this point. And what made you believe that the cofferdam would be truly successful, and that's going to be the methodology that we are going to be able to use here?
Well, I think about it now, and I think, well, probably was I don't know, kind of I should have thought twice about what I was doing back then, but I didn't. I just said, let's go ahead and give it a try, and let's hope
It's the
it
90s.
works.
We're still
And it did
smoking in
work.
restaurants.
There we go. So I just felt like it would work. I really felt like at the time, and I felt like that would be the way to excavate the ship. And also, with my terrestrial archaeology background, I turned this nautical site into a terrestrial site, so it made even better sense for me. And so when we built the cofferdam, pumped the water out, and we started excavating the ship. We found that the bottom third of the label was all that was left, but the cargo that we found in there, 86 barrels and 10 boxes, was the cargo that LaSalle had loaded in when he was ready to, well, part of it probably came over from France. Part of it he loaded in from his Fort St. Louis site when he sailed LaBelle to find to help find the Mississippi River. But that was the cargo he had left for building his colony. And what is so amazing about that is that that is what we've now called basically a kit for building a colony in the New World. And one of the only places I'm aware of where those artifacts have been found together intact. And that's because when LaBelle ran aground, it hit pretty hard, but the ship didn't break apart. So all the cargo was there as LaSalle had put it in. And he was not able to salvage, they were not able to salvage very much of the cargo. So a lot of it was left there for us to find and really excavate the artifacts and the barrels and boxes and open them up and peer back into the mind of an explorer coming to the New World. What was it they thought that they needed to survive? And it's interesting, we found huge quantities of a couple things. One is the lead shot for their muskets. They needed that for hunting and for defense. And we found vast quantities of trade items to trade to the Native American people. And the reason for that is that LaSalle, from his previous expeditions he had done in the Great Lakes looking for the Mississippi River, he had learned that trading with Native American people was critical for getting food, getting knowledge, and stuff like that. And so he brought a lot of trade goods over with him to trade to the what were the Karankawa Native people in that area.
So there's the path from Cofferdam excavation on the bottom. What was the bottom profile of the territory that the LaBelle went down in, right? So with something like Uluburun, which was on a huge slope, and a lot of those artifacts are falling downhill, essentially, was the LaBelle pretty much on a flat kind of surface area? What had the ocean currents and things? Because the Gulf is not a calm water, it's deep ocean. And so what had some of the currents done off the coast of Matagorda that spread the artifacts around? Had there been a lot of disturbance by the time you guys got to it?
No. In fact, you see, we're inside Matagorda Bay, so we don't have those strong currents.
Oh, okay.
So the ship, the bottom third of it, with all the cargo down in there in the barrels and boxes, was exactly as LaSalle had laid it out when he loaded the ship, and it just was there waiting to be discovered, and that's what made it so absolutely wonderful that we could see exactly what it was LaSalle was bringing and how he planned to use those items.
So the bay was sheltered.
The bay was sheltered. It was only 12 feet deep.
Oh, 12? That's it?
And
That's awesome.
yeah, 12 feet deep. Yes. And it's a miracle that shipwreck was not discovered. I think the muddy conditions, the zero visibility of Matagorda Bay protected the ship. But I did find a map of Matagorda Bay, a modern map that showed shipwreck locations for, where you want to, if you're a shipper, you want to stay away from. And our ship is on that list. It shows the location. It doesn't say what it is, but it's on that list. So it was an amazing discovery. And then as we started excavating this ship, we found out that we had way more than we thought. We ultimately ended up, you count all the little glass beads and the lead shot, the bullets and stuff like that, we found 1.8 million artifacts. And when we started the project, we thought we knew what we would find. We ended up finding vastly more than we thought originally. And that resulted in us beginning to run out of money. And so we were trying to fundraise concurrently with excavating the ship to keep everything going. And it was quite a project. And ultimately, a number of donors stepped in to help us with the ship. I remember one time a good friend of mine, former commissioner, he called up and said that you need money, I'm going to send you $5,000. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that, it's costing us, $100,000 a month to run the thing. That's going to get us a couple days. We need big money.
Let's get the Texas oil guys on this.
Yes. Well, Mobile Oil came up with a big check for us.
Did they really? That's really cool.
Yes. Yeah.
How did this go from cofferdam excavation to let's raise it? We're going to take it. We're going to take this whole thing back to the museum with us.
Well, we knew all the cargo would be taken out because, and in fact, what a lot of people don't appreciate for a shipwreck, the element that is preserving the artifacts is the water. And so as we excavated everything, even though we drained the water out, we still had hoses keeping everything moist all the time. And nighttime when we left, we would cover up everything to keep it moist. But that moisture was preserving everything. But the artifacts then, as we got them out, we would put them in water, and then we would ship them back to Texas A&M University to the Conservation Research Laboratory to do the treatments to preserve the artifacts. And when we got down to the very last major artifact, which was the remains of the hull of La Belle, then we made the decision we're going to take it out as well, and we dismantled it timber by timber and shipped all those timbers back to Texas A&M for the conservation. And that completed the project in about April of 1997.
And so once they're back at the conservation lab at Texas A&M University, had there been any talk about putting it back together and having it be an exhibit, or was it simply more along the lines of let's conserve these timbers until we know what to do with them, and then maybe we'll build a museum at some point that they can go into, or maybe we'll build a museum specifically around the La Belle, because there's, like you said, 1.8 million artifacts that came out of this.
Yes, well, in fact, in about the time we discovered La Belle, Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock said Texas needs a history museum. And with the discovery of La Belle, he said, I want that ship in the History Museum. So the History Museum was built with the idea that it would one day be the home for La Belle. The problem is that all those artifacts have to go through a lengthy conservation process before they can be displayed in a museum. And the ship itself, we started off using polyethylene glycol, an oil product, to preserve the timbers, to penetrate in there. And it's a synthetic wax, basically. And as that process went forward, oil prices went through the roof, and that became very, very expensive to try and complete. And we did have a chemical company that was giving us the ethylene glycol for free until oil prices skyrocketed. So then we switched, and we had put the ship back together for that, and it's been soaking it in polyethylene glycol. Then we drained it and we dismantled it, and we took the pieces and we freeze dried them. We built probably the world's largest freeze dryer for archaeological shipwreck specimens anywhere at Texas A&M University, and finished up the conservation for freeze drying. But that took many, many years. And so from 1997 until 2014, conservation was taking place on all those artifacts. But once we finished the conservation, then the Bob Bullock Texas History Museum was anxious to get the ship. And today, well, we brought the pieces of La Belle to the Bullock Museum in Austin, Texas. And in the atrium of the museum is where the final home of La Belle is. And we put the ship back together as a live exhibit over about a year and a half. And people could watch us doing the work as we assembled the ship. And I have to give credit to the chief conservator of La Belle, Peter Fix, for leading that effort. And of course, I worked with them, and we got the ship put back together. And then around it, we have these beautiful displays of artifacts from the ship. And some of the displays will go up 12, 14 feet high, where we have not just one or a dozen glass beads or maybe a dozen pieces of lead shot, but we have hundreds or thousands that go way up in the air on the display, to give you an idea visually of the volume of certain artifacts that LaSalle brought with him. And then we tell, why did he do that? So if anybody wants to learn more about La Belle, it's a beautiful exhibit at the History Museum in Austin, Texas. And it's a great way to see the actual ship and the contents that we found inside the ship.
We will absolutely put that website in our show notes as well, so people know where to find it and how to get there. We are pro history museum around here. What are some of the lessons and takeaways that came around because of the LaBelle excavations, right? We're using a lot of novel techniques. We're using a lot of very different conservation techniques with the freeze dryer and with the not using peg, because as far as I understand it, peg was a pretty reliable conservator tool for a long time. And so the freeze drying method, I don't know how old that one is. I haven't done as much research on freeze drying. I did a story on Texas A&M's freeze dryer a couple years ago for a magazine I worked at and talked to Chris Dostal about it.
Mm.
And so I've seen the giant freeze dryer in the back of the shed. And I'll put my photos on with the social media post for this, but it's enormous. And so what are some
Yes.
of the lessons learned and the new techniques that came around, and what did because LaBelle is important in the timeline of archaeological excavations and as a mile marker. What are some of the ways that LaBelle pushed those boundaries that we
Well,
see like echoing in modern archaeology now?
Well, I think a number of them, because a lot of the conservation techniques have been around for some period of time, but on every shipwreck you refine and figure out better ways of doing things. But I think what the LaBelle work told us is that freeze drying is really a good option for waterlogged timbers from a shipwreck. And I know now that the conservation lab is using freeze drying regularly as part of their effort to work on other shipwreck projects that come to their laboratory for conservation. Um, but I think the work also about the Cofferdam, it's interesting. It turned out it worked beautifully. An amazing way for us to be able to excavate all the 1.8 million artifacts, and some of them were very fragile, and we could work with them very, very slowly and take great care with them. And I think it opened the door that is a great way, when conditions are right, to excavate a shipwreck. The problem I have, though, is that no one's done it since. I've had people call me and say they're interested in trying to do it, but I think ultimately the costs of everything, begin to make it more difficult to replicate what we did with LaBelle. Someday somebody will do it, but until then, it hasn't happened. And I should add that from the very start to the very finish of the LaBelle being in the Bullock Texas State History Museum, it's an $18 million project. And that's a lot of money for archaeology. And so I think a lot of people, they think twice about trying to take on a project of that scope, with having to raise the money to make it all happen. It can be very complicated. So, but LaBelle, I think it also was very important for allowing us to understand what it took to build a colony in the New World. What are the objects that the explorer needed? And some of them are obvious. Some of them are surprising. I remember we found one artifact, which a larding needle, a little needle that you attach lard to it, and you run it through meat that you're cooking to leave the lard in there. There's fat. So here the French are coming to the New World and want to keep their cuisine with them. Worried about the taste of the meat that they will be cooking and stuff like that. So
We have ducks in Texas too.
yeah, there we go. So it's just some of what we found was obvious, some of what we found was perplexing, and some of it made you realize that you can see why the expedition failed. It was just set to fail for a number of reasons.
What were some of the weird experiences that you had excavating the LaBelle? Like, do you have any ghost stories? Was there anything kind of, I don't know, just generally spooky? You don't, it's not necessarily true, but like,
Yeah, no, well, I did, at the very beginning when we built the cofferdam, I worried about some sort of, I mean, because we were holding back a lot of water. and huge pressures on that cofferdam. And so I worried about some sort of catastrophic break and that water would come in, and it would be devastating for people working there. So I remember at the very beginning, I made these little marks around the walls of the cofferdam that I could see if there's any movement, and be ready to run out of there if something was going on. But fortunately, that didn't happen. It all worked out fine. But one of the strange things, though, that did happen after we finished excavating La Belle, France claimed the ship. And they sent an official claim to the U.S. State Department saying that that ship belonged to King Louis XIV, and today the Republic of France controls and owns everything that King Louis XIV had, and France claims the ship.
It's awful
And
convenient that you already spent the 18 million putting it back together.
yeah, exactly. And so, and this was 1997 when they sent that letter in. So, and it was amazing. This project got a lot of media attention in France, a lot of media attention, and that's what really spurred them to start researching, its ownership and all that. And they found this ledger or this book in Rochefort, France, where the Belle was built. It was vessels owned by King Louis XIV. And on a certain page there, it listed several vessels, including La Belle, and it gave basic measurements for it, but said that the ship was on loan to Salle in Mexico. And on the basis of that, they claimed the ship. And we in Texas were dismayed, about that. And so we were prepared because it was found in Matagorda Bay, not in the ocean or in the Gulf. And so we were preparing a legal effort to say that we own the ship, the Texas does. And before we could get very far on that, Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State at the time, and she had confirmed with the U.S. Navy, and the Navy said that we don't want to fight that. We don't want to, risk having bad case law that'll keep us from getting our nuclear submarine that goes down off the coast of France. And so Madeleine Albright basically just said, okay, we agree, France owns it. And that set in motion us negotiating a treaty, basically an international document, saying that France does in fact own La Belle and owns all the artifacts, but they'll stay in Texas forever unless Texas agrees they go someplace else. And in that document, I got inserted in there that we would have exchange of scholars back and forth to learn more about the ship, and that's gotten me several paid-for trips to France to research things, and that has been great. And I've since made good friends with the people in France, and the archaeologists, they didn't want the ship back in the artifacts. They just wanted to preserve the case law so that they could use it on other ships that might be discovered and maybe a treasure hunt to get them, and where they can go and get the ship and take control of it. So that was unexpected but fun. And as one little aside, we signed that treaty document in the treaty room at the U.S. State Department.
Oh, cool.
With the French ambassador was there, then a deputy secretary of state was there to sign the document.
That's really special.
Yeah, it was. It was a lot of fun.
With all that going on and with the media attention in France, was there a lot of media attention in the US as well? Did you guys have visitors who were not allowed to be there?
Well, let's see. We had tremendous media attention. In fact, every Tuesday we had a media day where we had a beautiful small little yacht that would pick up media in Palacios, where we had our headquarters, and bring them out to the Cofferdam and show them around. And so we got coverage in National Geographic, all the major magazines, the New York Times, all the TV stations, CNN came out there. And in fact, in 1996, a Houston newspaper said we were one of the top 10 media items of that year in Texas. So we got tremendous media attention, and I have to say that worked to our advantage for fundraising, because we were raising money all the time, but having a project that people have seen already on television or read about in the newspapers makes it easier to get the money that you need to complete the project. So it was I spent probably quarter of my time with media trying to get them all they needed about the Cofferdam and the ship.
Did you guys announce it, or did it leak?
Oh no, we had a press people at the Texas Historical Commission that worked nonstop. They were dedicated to it to get the word out and cultivate the media. So we wanted that, and we were contacting the media and getting CNN and everybody else to come on out there and covered the project.
Did you ever get anybody who attempted to loot the site?
When we first found LaBelle, and we announced that we had located the ship, but before we had decided to how we were going to excavate it, we did get one anonymous letter from some looters saying that they were going to go out there and find the ship and get it before we could get it. And that started us then having to send somebody to go out there daily to make sure the ship wasn't being looted. And we did that for about a year until we started doing the excavations of it. But we never had any looting of the ship because we were out there we worked 7 days a week, and we worked long hours. But every night we had a little building out there. We left one crew member to guard the ship, so it had 24/7 care and security. But while we were doing the excavation, so no difficulties there. We were desperately worried a hurricane would come and ruin everything, but luck was with us and no hurricanes. We did have storms. We had some really bad storms out there, but the Cofferdam held and everything was able to continue on shortly after the storms were finished.
Did any kind of weird stories come from that solitary guard duty?
Oh, let's see. I don't I did I'm sure they did. I'm sure the crew members talked to each other about it, but they didn't share any with me. Probably didn't want me to know what they were worried about.
How many cannons were pulled from that? Because I understand that the first cannon had particularly the Comte de oh, where'd my notes go?
Comte de Vermandois?
Yes, the Comte de Vermandois logo, seal, I think,
Yeah.
is the better
Yeah.
word for it.
Insignia. Yeah. We found 3 of those bronze cannons, and we found an impression where a 4th one had been. And we heard that story was going on that many years earlier, a shrimper was dragging over that area and had dragged one over and caught one of the cannons and could not bring it up into his shrimp boat, and so cut loose the cannon and dropped it someplace out there. So that's what we think is where the 4th bronze cannon was. And these cannons were not cannons that were used on board the ship. LaBelle had deck cannons, but these were going to be used for the settlement at the Mississippi River to fire against the whoever might come, the Spanish, whoever come trying to attack the French colony.
I think those are all the questions that I have for you. Do you have anything that you'd like to plug? Do you have any new books coming out, or do you have any new exhibits that are going to be in any new museums? We'd like to give you the chance to talk about that here.
Okay, well, we do. I remember when we have the big exhibit at the Bullock Texas State History Museum. But I remember when we finished excavating LaBelle, we had a bunch of the local museums around Matagorda Bay saying, well, we want to have exhibits on the stuff on the ship. And we decided that, okay, what we don't want to do is that everybody gets as much as they can and they all show everything and duplicate each other. So we came up with the idea of what's called the LaSalle Odyssey trail, where all the several museums that want to have LaBelle artifacts focus on a different type of artifact or a different part of the story. And that way encouraging people to go visit all of them, the museums, to learn the entire story. And that's been very, very successful. And so I encourage people that want to learn more, also head down to the Matagorda Bay area and visit the LaSalle Odyssey Trail, visit those museums and to learn more about the ship. So that's been really, really useful, really, I think, productive, important for those communities as well to be part of it. I have written 3 books on LaBelle. The first one was From a Watery Grave. the discovery and excavation of La Belle, and then a big technical book, a 900-page book with all the details, and then another, which is more of a catalog for the exhibit at the Bullock Museum. But I do have one more book on the overall story coming out, and that is on LaSalle's colony site, Fort St. Louis. We excavated there for 2.5 years and found the remains of some of the French colonists that died there. And we tell that side of LaSalle's doomed colony, what took place at Fort St. Louis and what the people were going through. And it paints, I think, a very interesting picture of these French colonists huddled together because the Karankawa Native Americans are attacking them, uncertain about how they can kill the bison and feed themselves. And these people that are totally, probably like us going to Mars, going on a new planet like that. Today we would know what to do, but we would still be unprepared. These people were totally unprepared for what they were experiencing in Texas. And so quite literally, from the diary and others, we see these people as kind of huddled in their little structures, worried about what's going to happen, and worried about how they keep going. And eventually, when LaSalle leaves to walk to Canada, the remaining colonists at Fort St. Louis are massacred by the Karankawa. They attacked and kill off the remaining people, with the exception of a few children who were raised as to be Indian children by the Karankawa. So, and I don't want to say anything negative about the Karankawa, because the difficulties there all stem from LaSalle's men stealing canoes from the Karankawa in a very abrupt and unfounded way. And so LaSalle was responsible for, or his men were responsible for what transpired with the Karankawa people, because up until those canoes were stolen, the Karankawa were actually friendly and trying to be helpful to them, and could have been if they'd had a better relationship at the beginning.
Yeah, I don't blame them at all.
No.
In fact, in the beeswax episode, talking about the Santo Cristo de Burgos, one of the accounts from the oral traditions, it says the white men became obnoxious.
Yeah.
And I think that's my favorite direct quote that I've come across so far.
I'm sure that's what the Karankawa were thinking about, and you know, this land was the Karankawa's land, and the French were coming in, colonizing their land and taking it for themselves, and it's just wrong on so many different levels. But that's history. History is good, bad, and ugly.
Yep. We cannot judge the past by today's morals, but we can absolutely look at them and still judge them because we want to.
And tell the whole story, the true story. And so
Yes.
on the book on the Fort St. Louis colony, we're trying to tell the real story, what transpired there. And so I think it'll be a good read. And then I should add that Spain had when they heard about LaSalle's, the French colony being built in what Spain perceived to be their part of the New World, they had a manhunt for finding the colony, 11 expeditions by land and by sea. And they eventually did find the remains of the Fort St. Louis colony, but after the colonists had been killed by the Karankawa. And then Spain came back and they built a presidio over top of the remains of the French fort. So we tell that story too, the Spanish side of things. And what's really neat about all of this is that today in Texas we have a wonderful Hispanic heritage that in many ways is due to LaSalle. LaSalle came, if he had been successful building his colony there and on the Mississippi River, our background, our history could be like New Orleans, French, but it failed. And it opened the door for Spain to realize that if they were going to hold on to this part of their territory in the New World, they had to populate it. And that's what resulted in the Presidio being built here and many other Spanish settlements being built throughout Texas, resulting in our wonderful Hispanic legacy. So what's so fun for me is that history can change on a dime. And here, the sinking of a ship, which doomed the colony, changed what could have been a French history for Texas, or at least the eastern part of Texas, to a Spanish history.
And I know Texas really loves that.
Yes, it's great, and it's also fun to tell Texans that, you know, our first European colony in Texas was French. People don't realize that. Though up until LaBelle people didn't realize that. Now more people do realize that.
It's just a series of unfortunate events and murder and snake bites and prickly pears.
Yes.
No water and all the water and their poor colony. Those poor people, they really went through it. Thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about the LaBelle. We really care about shipwrecks. We really care about science. We really care about giving archaeologists the platform to talk about that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you for what you do about nautical archaeology. It's great to get the word out more broadly for people to learn more about what we do with shipwrecks and excavating shipwrecks.
We really appreciate you coming on. We want to give a massive thank you to Dr. Jim Bruseth for coming onto the show, as well as the Bullock, Texas State History Museum, the Texas Historical Commission, and to everyone else who worked on the LaBelle and the excavations in the Cofferdam. We really like the story. It's really interesting, and we really sympathize with LaSalle. That guy did not have a great time. If you want to follow us on socials, you are more than welcome to. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at nautipodcast, on Gmail, thenautipod@gmail.com, and on YouTube and TikTok at nautipod. I'm so excited to make this podcast for you guys. I love making this. I love doing this. It is just me working on it, so please be patient while I line up some more interviews and get some more stuff going for you guys. I really, really love doing this. So stay tuned. I've got some really cool stuff in store, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Go get wet, nerds.